August 25, 1944. Paris, France. The morning air carried the lingering scent of celebration, wine, perfume, and freedom as dawn broke over the newly liberated city of light. Captain Marcus Wilson of the 761st Transportation Company stood at attention beside his supply truck, watching as Parisians emerged from their homes to greet another day of liberty. What he could not possibly know was that his arrival, along with hundreds of other Black American soldiers, would trigger a social revolution that would reverberate across 2 continents and challenge the very foundations of American racial ideology. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the untold story of how a group of segregated American soldiers found unprecedented acceptance in liberated Paris, and how their treatment by grateful French citizens would expose the contradictions of American democracy in ways that would ultimately help transform both nations. Captain Wilson adjusted his uniform and looked toward the Seine River, where the soft morning light painted the ancient buildings in hues of gold. His transportation unit had arrived in the pre-dawn hours, part of the massive logistical operation supporting the Allied advance across France. The 761st was one of many segregated black units in the United States Army, assigned primarily to service and supply roles, despite the soldiers' repeated requests for combat assignments. "Looks like we made it, sir," said First Sergeant James Holloway, approaching with a clipboard. "The convoy is unloaded, and the men are settling in at the temporary quarters on Rue Lafayette." "Any issues?" Wilson asked, his gaze still fixed on the skyline of the city he had only ever read about in books. "None yet. The French civilians have been—" Holloway paused, searching for the right words. "Different from what we expected." Wilson nodded. They had both grown accustomed to the rigid segregation of the American military and the open hostility they often faced from white American officers. The orientation briefings before deployment to Europe had warned black troops about maintaining proper distance from European civilians, especially women. The United States Army, even while fighting fascism abroad, had brought its racial hierarchy with it across the Atlantic. "Different how?" Wilson finally asked. "They're treating us like heroes," Holloway said quietly, "like regular soldiers, like men." Across Paris that morning, similar scenes were unfolding as elements of the Quartermaster Corps, Transportation Corps, and engineer units staffed predominantly by Black Americans arrived to support the continuing Allied push toward Germany. Among them was Private First Class Thomas Jefferson Jackson of the 3094th Quartermaster Service Company, a 23-year-old former college student from Philadelphia. Jackson's truck rumbled to a stop near Les Halles, the Central Market District, where his unit had been tasked with distributing food supplies to the still hungry civilian population. After 4 years of German occupation and rationing, Paris was desperately short of everything from bread to medicine. "Get those crates unloaded and set up distribution points according to the map," ordered Lieutenant Raymond Cooper, the white officer in charge of Jackson's platoon. "And remember the standing orders about fraternization." The standing orders were a euphemism for the unofficial but strictly enforced policy prohibiting Black American servicemen from forming relationships with European women. While white GIs were celebrated for their conquests, even encouraged with official leave passes and prophylactic kits, black soldiers faced court-martial, transfer to hazardous duties, or worse if caught in similar situations. Jackson and his squad began unloading crates of flour, canned meat, coffee, and chocolate, luxuries that most Parisians hadn't seen in years. As they worked, a small crowd began to gather. Unlike the segregated towns near army bases back home, where black soldiers were routinely refused service in restaurants and stores, the Parisians approached without hesitation. "Merci. Merci beaucoup." An elderly woman touched Jackson's arm, tears streaming down her weathered face. Before he could respond, she had pressed a small flask of wine into his hands. "Je vous en prie, madame," Jackson replied in the fractured French he had studied during the long transport across the Atlantic. His college education had included 2 semesters of French, never imagining he would actually use it in Paris. More Parisians arrived, reaching out to touch the American uniforms, offering cigarettes, flowers, and in some cases, kisses on both cheeks in the traditional French greeting. Jackson noticed a young woman watching him from the edge of the crowd. Unlike the others, she didn't push forward, but observed thoughtfully, a notebook clutched in her hands. "You speak French?" she asked in accented but clear English, finally approaching as the crowd thinned. "Just a little," Jackson admitted. "Enough to get into trouble, not enough to get out of it." She smiled. "I am Claudette Reynaud, a student at the Sorbonne. I am, with the resistance. We have been expecting the Americans for so long, but—" She paused, studying his face. "We did not know there were black Americans in your army." Jackson's expression remained neutral, a practiced response to the countless variations of this conversation he'd had since joining the military. "There are approximately 700,000 black soldiers serving," he said formally, "mostly in segregated units." Segregated. The word seemed to confuse her. Separated. Black soldiers and white soldiers in different units with different assignments. Claudette's brow furrowed. "But why? You all fight against the same enemy, no?" Before Jackson could formulate a diplomatic response, Lieutenant Cooper appeared beside them. "Private Jackson, you're needed back at the truck," he said sharply, not acknowledging Claudette's presence. "Now." "Yes, sir." Jackson nodded politely to Claudette and rejoined his unit. That evening, 3 separate incidents would set in motion the social earthquake that would eventually reach all the way to the United States Congress, the Pentagon, and the White House. At a small café near the Jardin du Luxembourg, Sergeant William Morris and Corporal Elijah Banks of the 1695th Engineer Combat Battalion sat outside, savoring cups of real coffee, a luxury after months of powdered substitutes. Both men had been among the first black combat engineers to land at Normandy, constructing roads and bridges under fire to support the Allied advance. "To Paris," Morris said, raising his cup. "Never thought I'd see it." "To being treated like a human being for a change," Banks countered. A waiter approached, accompanied by a middle-aged woman in an elegant, if somewhat worn, dress. "These gentlemen are my guests," she said in French to the waiter, placing enough francs on the table to cover several rounds of drinks. Turning to the Americans, she continued in precise English. "My son was a prisoner of the Germans for 3 years. Last week your army freed him. I can never repay this debt, but please accept my small gesture of gratitude." Before either soldier could respond, she had disappeared into the evening crowd. "Did that just happen?" Banks asked. "A white lady buying us drinks in public?" Morris laughed. "Welcome to Paris, my friend. Not at all like Alabama, is it?" Across town near Montmartre, Private First Class Robert Johnson of the 2072nd Quartermaster Truck Company found himself invited to a neighborhood celebration. The narrow street had been transformed with tables stretching from one end to the other. Laden with whatever food residents had managed to gather, thin soups made heartier with American rations, bread baked with flour from Allied supplies, and wine that had been hidden from German requisition in cellars and secret compartments. Johnson, who had grown up in Chicago's South Side, had never experienced anything like the scene before him. Here he was, seated at a table with French men and women of all ages, being served food, engaged in conversation through a mix of broken English, fractured French, and elaborate hand gestures. "A toast," called out an elderly Frenchman, standing with difficulty. The street fell silent as he raised his glass. "To our American liberators, to freedom, to equality." The crowd roared approval, and Johnson found his glass refilled immediately. Next to him sat Marie Dupont, a young widow whose husband had died fighting with the Free French forces in North Africa. Throughout the evening she had been helping translate, their heads bent close together in the candlelight. "He says they heard on the radio about American Negro soldiers," she explained, her English far better than the older man's. "He says France remembers her debt to black American soldiers from the last war, when the Harlem Hellfighters fought here. His brother served beside them. He says black Americans understand liberty because they have had to fight for it themselves." Johnson was speechless. The Harlem Hellfighters, the 369th Infantry Regiment, were legendary among black Americans. In World War I, they had spent more time in combat than any other American unit and had never lost a foot of ground or a man to capture. France had awarded the entire regiment the Croix de Guerre, while America had sent them home to segregation and race riots. "Tell him thank you," Johnson finally managed. "Tell him we're proud to be here." As the evening progressed, the atmosphere grew more festive. Someone produced an accordion, and the tables were pushed back for dancing. Without hesitation, Marie stood and extended her hand to Johnson. "Dance with me, soldier," she asked. In that moment, Johnson remembered the strict admonitions from white officers about maintaining the color line overseas. He thought about the consequences: potential court-martial, discipline, transfer. Then he looked at Marie's extended hand and the welcoming community around him. He stood and took her hand. The third incident occurred near the Champs-Élysées, where Staff Sergeant Benjamin Davis of the Red Ball Express, the massive truck convoy system that kept Allied armies supplied, had been granted a rare evening pass. The Red Ball Express was the lifeline of the American advance, with trucks running around the clock from the Normandy beaches to the front lines. Nearly 80% of Red Ball Express drivers were black Americans, their vital contribution to the war effort largely unrecognized in official accounts. Davis walked alone, taking in the sights of Paris by night. Despite 4 years of occupation, the city retained its magic. Couples strolled arm in arm, cafes bustled with activity, and music drifted from open windows. He was so engrossed in the scene that he nearly collided with a young woman hurrying in the opposite direction, her arms full of books. "Pardon," she exclaimed as several volumes tumbled to the sidewalk. "Let me help you with those," Davis said, quickly gathering the fallen books. "You are American," she observed, switching to English as he handed back the books. "Yes, ma'am." "Staff Sergeant Benjamin Davis." "Josephine Beaumont," she replied with a slight bow of her head. "I'm a professor of American literature at the Sorbonne, or I was, until the occupation. Now that the university will reopen, I am preparing my courses again." Davis examined the book in his hand before returning it. "The Souls of Black Folk" by W.E.B. Du Bois. "You know this work?" Josephine asked, her interest clearly piqued. "Yes, ma'am. Du Bois is required reading where I come from. I studied literature at Howard University before the war." "Howard University?" Her eyes widened. "The historically black institution in Washington? I have corresponded with professors there for my research. This is extraordinary. You must tell me about your studies." Before Davis could respond, a white military police officer approached, his expression hard. "Is this man bothering you, ma'am?" he asked Josephine, pointedly ignoring Davis. "Not at all," Josephine replied coolly. "The sergeant and I are having an academic discussion about American literature." The MP looked skeptical. "It's getting late, ma'am. Perhaps you should be on your way." "Perhaps you should be on yours, officer," Josephine replied with unexpected steel in her voice. "Unless the American army is now in the business of interrupting educational conversations among allies." The MP hesitated, clearly unused to being challenged, especially by a woman defending a black soldier. "Just doing my job, ma'am," he finally said, before continuing his patrol. "I apologize for my countrymen," Davis said quietly after the MP had gone. "No," Josephine said firmly. "You must never apologize for the small-mindedness of others. I have a small group of colleagues meeting tomorrow evening to discuss the reopening of the university. We would be honored if you would join us and share your perspectives on American literature, particularly the works of black authors." The invitation was so unexpected, so contrary to everything Davis had experienced in uniform, that he momentarily lost the ability to respond. "Unless you have other obligations," Josephine prompted. "No, ma'am," Davis finally managed. "I would be honored." As these and dozens of similar encounters unfolded across Paris that first night, none of the participants could have predicted the chain reaction they were setting in motion. Back in the segregated United States, military authorities and government officials would soon receive reports of these interactions with growing alarm. For black American soldiers, Paris was becoming not just a liberated city but a revelation, a first taste of what equality might actually feel like. For many French citizens, the presence of black American troops provided an opportunity to express not just gratitude for liberation, but also solidarity against oppression. And for white military authorities, it represented a dangerous crack in the foundation of segregation, one that threatened to undermine the entire edifice of racial separation they had carefully maintained, even while fighting a war against fascist ideology. By morning, word had spread among Black American units about their reception in Paris. For men accustomed to being denied service, forced to give up seats, or addressed only by boy rather than their rank, the normal human interactions they experienced with Parisians were revolutionary. Equally significant was the reaction of many white MPs and officers who attempted to intervene in these interactions with growing frequency and frustration. Sergeant James Edwards of the 761st Transportation Company found himself summoned to the temporary headquarters established in the Grand Hotel the following day. A career soldier who had served 6 years in the pre-war segregated army, Edwards was known for his professionalism and by-the-book approach. He was surprised to find not only his commanding officer, but also Major William Bradley, a white officer from the Provost Marshal's office responsible for military discipline. "Sergeant Edwards," Major Bradley began without preamble, "we have a situation developing that requires immediate attention. There have been numerous reports of inappropriate fraternization between colored troops and French civilians, particularly women." Edwards maintained a neutral expression, though he noted the deliberate use of colored rather than the military designation Negro troops or the more respectful black soldiers. "We need your help in communicating appropriate behavioral guidelines to your men," Bradley continued. "The French have different social customs, and they may not understand our American practices. It's creating confusion and potential for disorder." "What specific behaviors are causing concern, sir?" Edwards asked carefully. "Dancing in public establishments, dining together in restaurants, walking together on streets, conversations that could be misinterpreted as overly familiar," Bradley listed. "The French may not understand these actions could create misunderstandings." Captain Wilson, Edwards' commanding officer, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. "What the Major is requesting, Sergeant, is for us to remind our men of General Circular 35. General Circular 35 was a barely disguised order to maintain segregation overseas. While never explicitly mentioning race, it emphasized maintaining American customs and avoiding social situations that might create misunderstandings between Allied forces and local populations. "With all due respect, sirs," Edwards said carefully, measuring each word, "our men have been conducting themselves with discipline and professionalism. The interactions I've observed have been expressions of gratitude from French civilians for their liberation." "That may be," Major Bradley replied, "but we must maintain order and military discipline. The French have been without proper guidance for years under German occupation. They may have forgotten proper social boundaries." Edwards felt a slow burn of anger, but kept his expression neutral. The implication was clear. The problem wasn't white Americans trying to enforce segregation overseas. It was the French failing to understand why black Americans should be treated as inferior. "I'll communicate the orders, sir," he said finally. "Excellent. Have your unit leaders attend a briefing at 1600 hours today. We'll be distributing updated guidance on approved recreational areas and establishing separate facilities for colored troops to prevent any further confusion." After Major Bradley departed, Captain Wilson remained silent for a long moment. "You understand what's happening, don't you, Sergeant?" he finally asked. "Yes, sir. They're trying to build a separate Paris for black troops, just like back home." "Exactly. And they're doing it because they're seeing what's happening in the streets. French civilians, white French civilians, treating our men as equals, as liberators. They're panicking about what happens when our boys go home with these experiences." "What are your orders, sir?" Edwards asked. Captain Wilson sighed heavily. "Follow the official orders to the letter, Sergeant. Make sure our men understand the potential consequences of violating them. Court-martial. Transfer to labor battalions near the front. Dishonorable discharge. And unofficially, sir." "Unofficially?" Wilson allowed a slight smile. "Remind them that what happens on leave when they're not in uniform, in establishments without MPs present, well, that's between them and their conscience." That same morning, Thomas Jefferson Jackson found himself approached by Claudette Reynaud again. His unit was establishing a more permanent supply distribution center near the Seine, and she appeared carrying a basket of bread and cheese. "For you and your comrades," she said, setting it down among the grateful soldiers. "My father is a baker. This is his first batch with real flour in 4 years." "Thank you," Jackson said, surprised to see her again. "That's very kind." "I have been thinking about our conversation yesterday," she continued, "about segregated units. I have many questions if you would be willing to answer them." Jackson hesitated. "I'm not sure I should be discussing army organization with civilians," Claudette smiled. "I am not asking about military secrets, Private Jackson. I am a journalist. Or I was before the newspapers were controlled by the Germans. Now we are re-establishing free press, and I am writing about our liberators." "A journalist?" Jackson was both intrigued and wary. "For the underground newspaper during occupation, yes. Now for Le Monde, as it returns to publication. I want to understand the Americans who freed us. All of the Americans." She emphasized the last words meaningfully. Across Paris, similar conversations were taking place. French civilians, particularly those with connections to the resistance, intellectual communities and journalism, were discovering an aspect of American society that contradicted the democratic ideals the liberation represented. For many, it was incomprehensible that a nation fighting against Nazi racial ideology would maintain its own system of racial separation. At the same time, Black American soldiers were experiencing their first taste of being treated as equal human beings and first-class citizens. Men who had spent their entire lives navigating the complex and dangerous restrictions of American segregation found themselves able to enter restaurants, theaters, and shops without hesitation. They could speak to French women without fear of violent reprisal. They were addressed by their ranks and treated with respect by civilians. The contrast with their treatment within the American military structure could not have been more stark. While French civilians saw them as liberators and equals, many white American officers and MPs viewed them as a problem to be controlled. The result was an increasingly tense situation that would soon erupt into open conflict. By early September, the pattern was established. During duty hours, Black American soldiers served in their segregated units, primarily handling the massive logistical operations that kept the Allied advance moving toward Germany. Off-duty, despite official restrictions, many found their way to neighborhoods like Montmartre, Pigalle, and the Latin Quarter, where they were welcomed in cafes, dance halls, and homes. Increasingly frustrated white MPs conducted raids on establishments known to serve integrated clientele, often arresting black soldiers on trumped-up charges of disorderly conduct, while leaving white soldiers in the same locations undisturbed. Black soldiers with approved passes found themselves stopped repeatedly, their documents scrutinized, and their movements restricted by MPs who questioned their authorization to be in unauthorized areas, meaning any part of Paris where they might interact with French civilians as equals. In response, networks began to form. French resistance members, who had spent years developing systems to evade German patrols, now used those same skills to warn of approaching MPs. Cafe owners developed signals to indicate when military authorities were nearby. Black soldiers learned which establishments would welcome them through the front door and which required more discreet entrances. For many, the risk was worth taking. After facing discrimination at home and within the military, the acceptance they found among the French was too precious to surrender. Josephine Beaumont's academic gathering that Sergeant Davis had been invited to attend transformed into something more significant. What began as a discussion of American literature expanded to include French intellectuals, journalists, and former resistance members eager to understand the contradiction between America's stated ideals and its treatment of black citizens. Davis found himself not just participating, but becoming a central figure in these conversations. "You must understand," he explained to the group assembled in Josephine's apartment near the Sorbonne, "that while we fight in the same war, we fight two different battles, one against the external enemy and one for our own recognition as full citizens." "But surely," argued Pierre Lefort, a prominent philosopher who had maintained an underground classroom during the occupation, "after your service in this war, things must change. France learned this lesson after the Great War, when colonial troops from Africa and Indochina returned, having fought for France. How could we deny them citizenship rights after they had bled for the Republic?" Davis smiled sadly. "After the last war, black soldiers returned to race riots and lynchings. In 1919 alone, during what they called the Red Summer, there were nearly 40 riots across America targeting black communities, many specifically aimed at returning soldiers who dared to wear their uniforms in public. A shocked silence fell over the room. "They feared the very thing happening here in Paris," Davis continued. "Black men who had experienced treatment as equals, who had been given responsibility and authority, who had proven themselves in combat. Such men would no longer quietly accept second-class status." Claudette Reynaud, who had been invited by Josephine after they discovered their shared interest in the experiences of black American troops, was taking careful notes. "And what do you think will happen this time?" she asked. "After this war?" "I think," Davis said slowly, measuring his words, "that too many of us have seen alternatives now. Too many have experienced being treated as men, not as a color. The old system cannot stand unchanged." Across Paris, clusters of black American soldiers and French civilians were having similar conversations, in cafes, in bookstores, in universities, and in homes. The vibrant intellectual tradition of Paris, temporarily suppressed during the occupation but never extinguished, turned its attention to the paradox of American racial practices with fascination and moral clarity. As September progressed, tensions escalated. The United States Army, alarmed by reports of integration in Paris, implemented increasingly strict measures to reimpose segregation. New orders restricted black troops to specific areas of the city during off-duty hours. Passes for black soldiers were reduced, while leaves for white troops increased. Military police presence intensified in neighborhoods where black soldiers were known to socialize with French civilians. Simultaneously, articles began appearing in French newspapers questioning these practices. While careful not to directly criticize their liberators, publications like Le Monde Combat and Le Figaro ran stories highlighting the contributions of black American troops and subtly questioning the restrictions placed upon them. On September 15th, the situation reached a flashpoint. At a small jazz club in Montmartre, where black musicians from various army bands had been gathering for informal jam sessions with French musicians, a squad of military police conducted a raid. Witnesses would later report that the MPs entered with weapons drawn, ordered all soldiers to present their passes, and then selectively arrested only black soldiers, including several whose papers were in perfect order. As they attempted to load the arrested men into transport vehicles, a crowd of French civilians gathered, protesting the action. What began as verbal objections escalated when an MP struck an elderly Frenchman who stepped forward to argue on behalf of a soldier he recognized from the liberation of his neighborhood. The resulting confrontation, later downplayed in official reports as a minor disturbance, involved dozens of French civilians placing themselves between the MPs and the arrested soldiers. Women linked arms to block the street. Resistance veterans appeared with their own weapons. The standoff lasted nearly an hour before the local French police arrived, led by a precinct captain who had fought with the Free French forces. After a tense negotiation, the French police captain convinced the MPs to release the soldiers with valid passes into his custody, promising they would be returned to their units. As soon as the MPs departed, however, he simply verified their passes himself and released them, to the cheers of the gathered crowd. News of the incident spread rapidly through both French and Black American communities. For the United States Army Command, it represented a dangerous development, French authorities actively interfering with military discipline. For black soldiers, it was confirmation that the French saw them as equals deserving of protection. For the French, it became a symbol of their commitment to the liberté, égalité, fraternity that defined their national identity. Major General Samuel Harrison, recently appointed as the military governor of the Paris region, called an emergency meeting of his staff the following morning. "This situation is becoming untenable," he informed the assembled officers. "We have reports of French newspapers preparing articles directly criticizing our military policies, civilian interference with MP operations, underground newsletters circulating among colored troops, encouraging them to defy regulations. We must re-establish proper order before this undermines the entire Allied command structure." Colonel Robert Thompson, the highest-ranking black officer in the European theatre, attached to the Quartermaster Corps, had been summoned to the meeting, an unusual step that highlighted the seriousness of the situation. "Colonel Thompson," General Harrison continued, "your insight would be valuable here. How do we communicate the necessity of maintaining our established practices to our colored troops?" Thompson, a career officer who had navigated the complexities of being a black man in command within a segregated military for over 15 years, chose his words with diplomatic precision. "Sir, with respect, I believe we are addressing the symptoms rather than the cause. Our men are experiencing equal treatment from the French population for the first time in their lives. The contrast with their treatment within our own military structure is stark." "That may be," Harrison replied impatiently, "but we cannot reorganize the entire United States Army in the middle of the largest military operation in history. We need practical solutions to maintain discipline and order. Perhaps," Thompson suggested carefully, "rather than increasing restrictions, which creates resentment and resistance, we might consider limited integration of recreational facilities, designated establishments where both white and colored troops could—" "Absolutely not," interrupted Colonel James Whitmore, the Provost Marshal. "That would directly contradict War Department policy and create confusion in the ranks. Segregation of facilities has been the cornerstone of maintaining order." "Has it?" Thompson asked quietly. "Because from my observation, attempts to impose American segregation in a city that doesn't practice or understand it are precisely what's causing the disorder we're trying to prevent." The room fell silent. It was rare for a black officer, even one of Thompson's rank, to directly challenge established policy. General Harrison studied Thompson for a long moment. "I understand your perspective, Colonel, but my orders are to maintain military discipline according to established protocols. We'll increase MP patrols in problem areas, restrict passes more rigorously, and coordinate with French authorities to ensure their cooperation." He turned to his staff intelligence officer. "And I want those French journalists identified. If they're receiving information from our personnel, that's a security breach." As the meeting concluded, Thompson was asked to stay behind. Once they were alone, Harrison's tone changed. "Off the record, Colonel, do you believe this situation could escalate further?" "Yes, sir, I do," Thompson replied honestly. "The men have seen something they can't unsee, the possibility of being treated as equals. Attempting to force them back into rigid segregation after that experience. It's like trying to put toothpaste back in the tube." Harrison sighed. "I don't disagree with you, Thompson, but my hands are tied by policies established well above my pay grade. I need your help to prevent this from becoming a full-blown crisis that could undermine the war effort." "What are you asking, sir?" "Work through your channels, talk to the colored officers and non-coms, make them understand that while changes may come eventually, now in the middle of the war, is not the time to challenge the system. After victory is secured, there will be opportunity for reconsideration of policies." Thompson recognized the request for what it was, an attempt to use his influence to maintain the status quo with vague promises of future change. It was a familiar pattern, one that had been repeated throughout American history. "I'll communicate your message, sir," he said finally. "But I should warn you, the men are not just reacting to French acceptance. They're reacting to the contrast between how they're treated by the people they liberated and how they're treated by their own countrymen. That contradiction is becoming increasingly difficult to rationalize or accept." As Thompson departed, he knew that the general's approach would fail. The situation in Paris had moved beyond the control of military authorities. Too many connections had been formed, too many experiences shared, too many expectations raised. The segregation system that depended on isolation and separation was crumbling in the face of human relationships that transcended its artificial boundaries. Meanwhile, Claudette Reynaud was putting the finishing touches on her article for Le Monde, titled "The Paradox of Liberation: America's Black Soldiers in Paris." It would become one of the most widely read and reprinted pieces of the immediate post-liberation period. Based on dozens of interviews with black American servicemen and observations of their treatment by both French civilians and American authorities, the article directly addressed the contradiction at the heart of the American military presence. Thomas Jefferson Jackson, had become one of her primary sources, introducing her to soldiers from various units and helping to explain the complexities of American racial practices that were often incomprehensible to French citizens. Their professional relationship had gradually evolved into a friendship and increasingly something more, though both were careful to maintain appropriate public boundaries, aware of the risks Jackson faced. "Will you read it before I submit it?" Claudette asked, handing him a translated draft of her article during one of their now regular meetings at a small cafe near the Pantheon, chosen specifically because it was rarely frequented by American military personnel. Jackson read slowly, his expression growing more serious with each paragraph. The article was remarkably direct, describing the segregation policies of the American military in detail and contrasting them with both French social practices and American stated ideals. It included anonymous quotes from soldiers describing their experiences of discrimination within the military and their contrasting treatment by French civilians. Most provocatively, it drew explicit parallels between Nazi racial ideology and American segregation practices, a comparison that would infuriate American authorities while resonating deeply with French readers still processing their experience of occupation. "This will cause an explosion," Jackson said finally, returning the pages. "You realize that?" Claudette nodded. "That is the intention. The truth should cause an explosion when it has been suppressed for too long. They'll try to identify your sources. The men you quoted, even anonymously, could face serious consequences. I have been careful. No names, no unit designations, no identifying details. And the French press is no longer subject to American military censorship, not since the provisional government was recognized." Jackson sighed. "It's not just the men I'm worried about. They'll come after you too." Claudette's expression hardened slightly, a glimpse of the resistance fighter visible beneath the journalist's exterior. "Let them try. I spent 4 years writing truth under the threat of German reprisal. I am not afraid of American disapproval." "It's more than disapproval, Claudette. They'll pressure your editors, threaten to withhold supplies from newspapers, possibly even declare certain areas off-limits to French journalists for security reasons. And you think Le Monde will submit to such pressure after standing against German occupation? No, Thomas, the free French press has returned, and we will not be silenced again, not even by our liberators." Jackson studied her determined expression and realized she was right. The American military authorities fundamentally misunderstood the French people they had liberated. Having endured German occupation, having maintained their principles through years of oppression, they would not easily surrender their commitment to equality simply to accommodate American racial practices. "There's one more thing," Claudette said, pulling another sheet of paper from her notebook. "A letter has been circulating among the black American soldiers. Someone brought it to me, thinking it should be published alongside my article. It's quite powerful." Jackson took the paper, immediately recognizing the typewritten page that had been passed from hand to hand among black troops in recent days. The letter, addressed to those concerned with democracy, had originated with a group of black non-commissioned officers and had been edited and refined through countless discussions. "We, the undersigned Negro American soldiers," it began, "having risked our lives to liberate foreign soil from the tyranny of fascism, respectfully ask when our own nation will liberate us from the tyranny of racism. We have crossed an ocean to secure freedom for others that we ourselves are denied at home." The letter continued, eloquently contrasting the reception black soldiers had received from the French with their treatment by the American military and society. It asked pointed questions about the meaning of democracy and the moral authority of a nation that practiced systematic discrimination while claiming to fight for freedom. It concluded with a powerful statement: "We return to battle tomorrow, willing to die if necessary for American principles that America itself does not apply to us. We ask not for special treatment, but for the basic human dignity that French civilians, themselves just liberated from oppression, have shown they understand better than our own countrymen. If they can recognize our humanity after 4 years of occupation, what excuse remains for our own nation after 168 years of constitutional democracy?" The letter was unsigned, a necessity given the risks involved, but its authenticity was unmistakable. It expressed sentiments Jackson had heard in countless late-night conversations among his fellow soldiers. "You can't publish this," he said finally, handing it back. "The men who wrote it would be court-martialed for insubordination at minimum. I would not publish it without consent," Claudette assured him. "But doesn't its existence prove the importance of my article? This letter shows the true thoughts of American soldiers that your military authorities are trying to suppress." Jackson couldn't argue with her logic. The letter represented the private thoughts of thousands of black troops, thoughts they could express freely only outside the military structure, only in Paris, only in this unique moment where they existed between two worlds, the segregation of the American army and the equality of French society. "Your article will change nothing in the American military," he said finally. "They're too committed to their system, too invested in maintaining it." Claudette smiled. "Perhaps not immediately. But truth has a power of its own, Thomas. Once spoken, it cannot be unheard." On September 23, 1944, Le Monde published Claudette's article. The impact was immediate and far-reaching. Within days, it had been translated and reprinted in underground newspapers, reaching black American troops throughout the European theater. Copies made their way to London, where they were read by black servicemen stationed in England and forwarded to contacts in the United States. French public reaction was overwhelmingly supportive of the black American soldiers. Cafes and restaurants began posting signs in their windows, explicitly welcoming all Allied troops without distinction, a clear statement against segregation. Dance halls and theaters made similar declarations. French citizens, particularly young women, deliberately engaged with black soldiers in public, often linking arms with them while walking past military police patrols, a direct challenge to American attempts to prevent fraternization. The United States Military Command responded with increasing desperation. Black troops were transferred from Paris to more remote areas whenever possible. Leave policies were restructured to minimize the number of black soldiers in the city at any given time. Military police patrols were intensified. Pressure was applied to French government officials to control their press and citizens. None of these measures proved effective. The connections between black American soldiers and French civilians had already been established. Networks of communication and support were firmly in place. Most significantly, the fundamental contradiction had been exposed for all to see. America was attempting to enforce abroad the very sort of racial distinctions it was fighting against in the Nazi ideology. Among the black American troops, a new consciousness was emerging, one that would have profound implications when they returned home. Men who had experienced being treated as equals, who had formed relationships based on mutual respect rather than racial hierarchy, who had seen an alternative to American segregation, would never again accept second-class citizenship without question. Sergeant William Morris expressed this transformation during a conversation with Corporal Elijah Banks as their unit prepared to move eastward with the continuing Allied advance. "You know what Paris did to me," Morris said as they packed their equipment. "It ruined me for going back home." "How do you mean?" Banks asked. "Once you've tasted being a man, a full man, treated with respect, able to walk down the street without stepping off the sidewalk for white folks, able to look a white woman in the eye without fear of being lynched, how do you go back to being 3/5 of a person?" Banks nodded slowly. "I've been thinking the same thing. When this war ends, things will have to change back home. They'll have to." "They won't change on their own," Morris replied. "We'll have to make them change. All of us who've seen what's possible here, we can't unsee it, can't unfeel it, can't go back to the old ways." "No," Banks agreed. "We can't." This sentiment was echoed in countless conversations among black troops as they moved forward with the Allied advance. Paris had transformed them, not just by how they were treated by the French, but by showing them the possibility of a society without rigid racial barriers. That vision, once glimpsed, could never be forgotten. For the French women who had formed relationships with black American soldiers, the situation was equally transformative. Women like Marie Dupont, who had found both companionship and renewed hope through her friendship with Private First Class Robert Johnson, faced the approaching departure of American units with a mixture of sadness and determination. "Will you write to me?" she asked during their final evening together before his unit moved toward the German border. "Every chance I get," Johnson promised, "but you should know it won't be easy when I get back home. The things we've done here, simple things like walking together, dining in restaurants, they could get a man killed in parts of America." Marie's expression hardened slightly. "Then America must change too. France is not perfect. We have our own prejudices, our own colonial sins. But what I feel for you has nothing to do with your color and everything to do with who you are." Johnson took her hand, a public gesture that would have been unthinkably dangerous in his hometown. Paris has been like living in the future, a future where people see each other as people first. I want that future to exist back home too. "Then make it exist," Marie said simply. "You and all the others who have seen what is possible." Similar scenes played out across Paris as American units continued the push toward Germany. What had begun as simple human connections between liberators and liberated had evolved into something more profound, a shared vision of a more equal world and a commitment to creating it. As autumn progressed, the American military authorities gradually realized they were fighting a losing battle. Despite their best efforts, they could not prevent the formation of relationships between Black American soldiers and French civilians. More significantly, they could not prevent the psychological transformation that occurred when Black servicemen experienced life without American-style segregation. By October, a grudging acceptance had begun to replace active resistance among some military leaders. Colonel Thompson, who had predicted the failure of increased restrictions, was quietly consulted about alternative approaches. While formal segregation remained official policy, enforcement became increasingly selective, focused primarily on preventing the most visible or publicized challenges to the system, rather than attempting to control every interaction. The United States military's attention was necessarily focused on the continuing war effort, with the push into Germany taking priority over social control in Paris. This shift created additional space for relationships to develop and communities to form. For Thomas Jefferson Jackson and Claudette Reynaud, this period brought both greater freedom and increased anxiety. As their relationship deepened beyond professional collaboration, they were acutely aware of the limited time they had together. Jackson's unit would eventually be ordered eastward, and the future beyond that remained uncertain. "What happens after the war?" Claudette asked during one of their increasingly precious evenings together at a small restaurant near Montparnasse. "Will you return to America immediately?" "Probably," Jackson replied, "though demobilization might take months, even after victory. Millions of men can't all go home at once." "And then?" "Back to Philadelphia, to college." Jackson considered her question carefully. Like many Black soldiers, he had been contemplating his future in America with new perspective after his experiences in Paris. "I want to finish my degree," he said finally. "Then maybe law school. This war, and Paris especially, has shown me that change is possible, but it has to be fought for, negotiated, established in law." Claudette nodded. "A noble path and personal considerations. Do those factor into your plans?" The question hung between them, laden with unspoken possibilities and complications. "Claudette," Jackson began carefully, "what we've experienced here exists in a kind of bubble, a moment outside the normal world, created by extraordinary circumstances. In America, the relationship we have, it wouldn't just be difficult, it could be dangerous." "You think I don't understand danger?" she replied, a hint of steel entering her voice. "I carried messages past German checkpoints for 3 years. I printed resistance newspapers when discovery meant torture and death. I am not afraid of American prejudice." "It's not just prejudice," Jackson explained. "In many states, our marriage would be literally illegal. We could be arrested for living together. Children we might have would face discrimination from all sides." "Then we would live elsewhere," Claudette said simply. "There must be places, even in America, where such things are possible." "There are," Jackson acknowledged, "but even there, life would not be easy. Life is never easy, Thomas. The question is whether it is worth living. What we have found together, Is that not worth fighting for, just as we fought for liberation? Before Jackson could respond, an MP patrol entered the restaurant. Though such inspections had become less frequent, they had not ceased entirely. Jackson tensed, preparing for the usual check of his leave pass and the potential harassment that often accompanied such encounters. To his surprise, the patrol's sergeant merely glanced in their direction, made a brief notation on his clipboard, and continued his circuit of the establishment without approaching them. It was a small thing, perhaps insignificant in the larger context of the war, but it represented a subtle shift, a tacit acknowledgement that some battles were not worth fighting, that some changes could not be reversed. As autumn turned to winter, the situation in Paris stabilized into an uneasy compromise. Formal segregation remained official policy within the United States military, but its enforcement in relation to French civilians became increasingly selective and sporadic. Black American soldiers continued to find acceptance and equality in their interactions with the French population, forming relationships and connections that would influence both societies long after the war. Most significantly, the experiences of black troops in Paris catalyzed a profound change in consciousness. Men who had lived their entire lives within the constraints of American segregation had now experienced an alternative, had been treated with dignity, respect, and equality. That experience could not be erased or forgotten when they returned home. By December 1944, the Allied focus had shifted decisively to the German border and the final push into the Third Reich. Many of the units that had participated in the liberation of Paris had moved eastward with the advance, including the transportation and supply companies that had employed so many black American soldiers. Before his deployment further east, Staff Sergeant Benjamin Davis made a final visit to the intellectual salon that had formed around Josephine Beaumont. What had begun as a small gathering of academics had evolved into a significant nexus of French-American cultural exchange, particularly focused on issues of race, democracy, and human rights. "We have been discussing the impact of your experiences on post-war society," Josephine explained as she introduced Davis to several new participants, including representatives from emerging political parties in the provisional French government. "Many of us believe that what has happened here in Paris, the relationships formed between black American soldiers and French citizens, represents a model for the future." "A model for what?" Davis asked. "For how nations might move beyond the artificial barriers of race," replied Jean-Paul Mercier, a philosophy professor who had become a regular participant. "What has occurred here demonstrates that such divisions are constructed, not natural, and what is constructed can be deconstructed." "That's a hopeful view," Davis said, "but I'm not sure American society is ready for such deconstruction." "Perhaps not immediately," Josephine acknowledged, "but seeds have been planted here, in you and your fellow soldiers, and in the French citizens who have come to know you. Those seeds will grow into something significant, I believe." As the evening progressed, Davis found himself drawn into discussions about post-war reconstruction, not just of buildings and infrastructure, but of societies and relationships. The French intellectuals, having experienced the catastrophic failure of their own society under occupation, were eagerly exploring new possibilities for social organization, possibilities that included questioning fundamental assumptions about race, class, and national identity. For Davis, who had studied these questions academically before the war, the opportunity to engage with leading European thinkers as an equal participant rather than as an object of study was profound. He recognized that something historic was occurring, not just the military defeat of fascism, but the emergence of new ideas about human society that would shape the post-war world. As the evening concluded, Josephine drew him aside. "I have something for you," she said, presenting him with a small, carefully wrapped package, a token of our appreciation for your contributions to our discussions. Davis unwrapped the gift to find a first edition of Richard Wright's Native Son, published in 1940. "How did you find this?" he asked, amazed. Wright's powerful novel about race in America had been unavailable in occupied France. "It arrived in a diplomatic pouch from London last week," Josephine explained. "Several of us had requested American literature for the university library's reconstruction. When this arrived, we all agreed it should go to you." "I'm honored," Davis said sincerely. "There is an inscription," Josephine noted. Davis opened the book to find a handwritten message on the title page, signed by each member of the discussion group. It read simply, "The conversations we have shared prove that a different world is possible. Carry this knowledge home with you." The gift represented more than personal appreciation. It acknowledged that the intellectual exchange had been genuine and equal, that the French participants had learned from Davis as much as he had from them. It recognized his dual identity as both a soldier and a scholar, a liberator and a man of ideas. Most importantly, it affirmed the transformative potential of the relationships formed in Paris. Ideas had been exchanged, perspectives shared, and mutual respect established across boundaries of race and nationality. These connections, multiplied across thousands of similar interactions throughout the city, constituted a quiet revolution, one that would continue to unfold long after the war had ended. Meanwhile, the imminent departure of many black units from Paris lent urgency to personal relationships. Private First Class Robert Johnson and Marie Dupont faced their impending separation with a mixture of sorrow and determination. "I've spoken with a lawyer," Marie told him during one of their final evenings together, "about the possibilities for after the war." "What possibilities?" Johnson asked. "Marriage," she said simply, "immigration, a future together, whether in America or France." Johnson was silent for a long moment. The idea of a permanent relationship, one that would extend beyond the extraordinary circumstances of wartime Paris, was both exhilarating and terrifying. "Marie," he finally said, "you need to understand what you'd be facing in America. The discrimination, the hostility, the legal barriers in many states. And you need to understand that I have considered these things," she replied firmly. "I do not make this suggestion lightly or romantically. I have spoken with other French women who have formed relationships with black American soldiers. We have educated ourselves about the realities." Indeed, a network of French women in relationships with black American servicemen had formed in Paris, sharing information, resources, and support. They had collectively researched American immigration laws, state-by-state restrictions on interracial marriage, and communities where mixed couples might live safely. Their approach was not naive but practical, a clear-eyed assessment of challenges and possibilities. "There would be options," Marie continued. "New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, cities where such relationships, while not fully accepted, are at least legal. Or we could remain in France if your skills would transfer here." Johnson, who had worked as a mechanical engineer before being drafted, considered this possibility. "There might be opportunities in reconstruction," he acknowledged. "Europe will need rebuilding after the war." "Precisely. And France will remember those who liberated her. There would be possibilities." The conversation revealed how much had changed in just a few months. What had begun as a chance encounter during liberation had evolved into a serious consideration of a shared future, one that challenged not just personal expectations, but social and national boundaries. Similar conversations were occurring across Paris as black American soldiers and their French connections confronted imminent separation. Some relationships would end with deployment, others would be maintained through letters and promises of reunion after the war. A significant number would result in marriage, immigration, and permanent life changes. In each case, the relationships represented a challenge to the established order, proof that human connections could transcend the artificial barriers of race and nationality. The very existence of these relationships was revolutionary in the context of 1944, when segregation remained firmly entrenched in American law and custom. For Thomas Jefferson Jackson and Claudette Reynaud, the approaching separation prompted a final collaboration. Claudette had continued documenting the experiences of black American troops in Paris, gathering material for what she envisioned as a book-length exploration of the subject. Jackson had been her primary liaison, helping to arrange interviews and providing context for American racial practices that were often incomprehensible to French observers. "I want to ensure this story isn't forgotten," Claudette explained as they organized her notes in her small apartment near the newspaper offices. "When the war ends, there will be pressure to return to normal, but normal was not just or right. There will be resistance, Jackson agreed. Both in America and here, people will want to forget the contradictions, the uncomfortable questions. Which is precisely why we must document them now, while the experiences are fresh, while the witnesses are still present. Jackson studied the materials they had gathered: interviews, photographs, letters, official documents, and personal observations. Together they told a powerful story of transformation, one that contradicted the official narrative of a smooth, unproblematic liberation. "What will you call it?" he asked. Claudette considered for a moment. "Paris Noir," she finally said. "A double meaning, both the black presence in Paris and the dark contradictions exposed by that presence." "Perfect." Jackson nodded. "When will you publish?" "After the war," she said, "when it can have the greatest impact, when soldiers have returned home and societies are deciding what kind of peace they will build." The project represented more than historical documentation. It was an intervention in the politics of memory, an attempt to ensure that the complexity of liberation, with all its contradictions and revelations, would not be simplified or sanitized in official histories. It was also, though neither said it explicitly, a way of maintaining their connection across the coming separation and uncertainty. The shared work created a bridge to the future, a reason for continued communication, a promise of reunion. As winter settled over Paris and the front lines pushed eastward, the extraordinary moment that had begun with liberation began to transition into something else, not an ending, but an evolution. The relationships formed between Black American soldiers and French citizens had created networks of communication, support, and understanding that would outlast the immediate circumstances of their creation. French journalists continued to write about the experiences of Black American troops, often drawing explicit connections to France's own colonial relationships and racial hierarchies. Intellectual discussions about race, democracy, and human rights expanded beyond salons into public forums, classrooms, and political debates. Personal relationships between soldiers and civilians deepened, with plans made for post-war reunions, marriages, and migrations. Most significantly, the consciousness of Black American servicemen had been permanently altered. Men who had lived their entire lives within the constraints of American segregation had experienced an alternative reality, had been treated as full and equal human beings, had formed relationships across racial boundaries without fear of violence or reprisal, had been valued for their individual qualities rather than collectively denigrated. This transformation would have profound implications when they returned to the United States after the war. Black veterans who had experienced Paris would become leaders in the nascent civil rights movement, bringing with them the knowledge that alternatives to segregation were not just theoretical, but practical and achievable. Their experiences would inform legal challenges, community organizing, and personal acts of resistance against the American racial system. The United States military and government recognized this threat to the established order. As the war neared its conclusion, policies were implemented to minimize the impact of overseas experiences on returning Black troops. Segregated units were often the last to be demobilized, keeping soldiers away from civilian society as long as possible. Debriefing sessions emphasized the special circumstances of wartime Europe and the necessity of readjustment to American customs. Most disturbingly, Black veterans who returned wearing their uniforms, visible symbols of service and sacrifice that demanded respect, faced targeted violence in many communities. The message was clear. Regardless of their contributions to victory, Black Americans were expected to resume their subordinate status. But the transformations that had begun in Paris could not be so easily reversed. Too many connections had been formed, too many experiences shared, too many expectations raised. The very fact that Black Americans had fought for democracy abroad highlighted the absence of democracy at home. The contrast between their treatment by grateful Europeans and their reception in the country they had defended was too stark to ignore or explain away. As the Allied armies pushed into Germany and victory approached, the legacies of the Paris experience were already taking shape. Networks established between Black veterans and French supporters would provide channels for the exchange of ideas, resources, and strategies in the post-war years. Personal relationships formed during liberation would result in marriages, migrations, and binational families that challenged racial categorizations. Most significantly, the consciousness raised in Paris would fuel the growing civil rights movement in America. Black veterans, having experienced life without segregation, would return with both the knowledge that alternatives were possible and the moral authority of having defended a democracy that did not defend them. Their experiences would become powerful testimony in the struggle for equality. The French women who had formed relationships with Black American soldiers would face their own challenges and transformations. Some would emigrate to the United States, confronting American racism directly as they built lives with their partners. Others would remain in France, maintaining connections through letters and occasional visits. Many would become advocates for racial equality and human rights, their personal experiences informing their political commitments. For Claudette Renaud, the documentation project that began during liberation would evolve into a lifelong commitment to recording and analyzing racial dynamics in both American and French societies. Her work would help establish a tradition of critical examination of race relations that influenced both academic discourse and public policy. Thomas Jefferson Jackson would complete his education after the war, becoming an attorney specializing in civil rights cases. His experiences in Paris would inform his legal approach, providing both practical knowledge of alternatives to segregation and personal testimony to the arbitrary nature of racial distinctions. His ongoing relationship with Claudette would create a transatlantic connection that facilitated the exchange of ideas and strategies between American civil rights activists and European supporters. Staff Sergeant Benjamin Davis would return to his academic career after demobilization, eventually becoming a professor of American literature with a focus on works by Black authors. The intellectual connections he formed in Paris would develop into professional collaborations, resulting in translations of key texts, international conferences, and exchange programs that enriched both American and French understanding of racial dynamics. Private First Class Robert Johnson and Marie Dupont would navigate the complex legal and social barriers to their relationship, eventually marrying and settling in Chicago, where Johnson's engineering skills found application in the post-war building boom. Their home would become a gathering place for other Franco-American couples, creating a supportive community for families navigating the challenges of interracial and international marriage. Sergeant William Morris and Corporal Elijah Banks, who had first experienced equal treatment in a cafe near the Luxembourg Gardens, would both become active in veterans organizations advocating for equal rights. Their wartime experiences provided powerful testimony against segregation, directly challenging the notion that racial separation was natural or necessary for social harmony. As the war in Europe reached its conclusion in May 1945, the full significance of what had occurred in Paris was still emerging. What began as a liberation had become something more, a revelation of possibilities, a challenge to assumptions, a glimpse of a different future. The Black American soldiers who experienced Paris and the French citizens who welcomed them had together created a moment of transformation that would continue to reverberate long after the echoes of battle had faded. The relationship between Black American servicemen and French civilians during the liberation of Paris represented more than a footnote in military history. It was a profound human encounter that exposed contradictions, challenged assumptions, and opened possibilities for both societies. In the space created by liberation, a moment when normal rules were suspended and new relationships became possible, individuals discovered the arbitrary nature of racial boundaries and glimpsed alternatives to established hierarchies. For the Black American soldiers who experienced this revelation, Paris represented not just a liberated city, but a liberation of consciousness, a first taste of what equality might actually feel like. For the French citizens who formed relationships with these soldiers, the encounter revealed both the contradictions of American democracy and the unexamined assumptions of their own society. Together, they created connections that transcended national and racial boundaries, demonstrating that human relationships could flourish outside the constraints of segregation. These connections, personal, intellectual, political, and cultural, would continue to develop in the post-war years, creating channels for the exchange of ideas, strategies, and support in the ongoing struggle for racial equality. The story of Black American soldiers in liberated Paris reminds us that transformative moments often occur in unexpected contexts, that official histories rarely capture the full complexity of human experience, and that individual relationships can challenge and ultimately change social systems. It demonstrates that liberation is not a single event, but an ongoing process, one that continues to unfold as people recognize and act upon the possibilities revealed in moments of change. In the decades following World War II, the experiences of Black American troops in Paris would inform the civil rights movement, shape international perspectives on American race relations, and influence the development of post-colonial thought in France. The connections formed during those extraordinary months of liberation would create lasting bridges between cultures, generating new understandings and possibilities that continue to resonate in the present. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.